There are moments in life when everything seems uncertain. Times when the chapters of our story feel unfinished and we're stuck in the middle of a plot that doesn't make sense. Maybe you've had those moments where the weight of disappointment or loss feels like it will define you forever. You may even wonder if your story has an ending that's already been written. But I'm here to remind you today that your story is not over. God is still writing it. The beautiful thing about life is that it's not just a straight line from point A to point B. It's full of twists and turns, highs and lows, and unexpected detours. And in all of that, God is working behind the scenes, crafting a story far greater than we could ever imagine. Sometimes we get frustrated or disheartened because we think we've reached a dead end. But God is never done with us. He doesn't work in the way we think he should. Where we see a period, he sees a comma. There are times when we may look at our lives and think, how could something good come from this? How could God possibly redeem this situation? But it's in these very moments that God often works his most powerful miracles. What seems like an ending to us is often just the beginning of something new. The chapters you think are closed may only be a pause before he moves in ways you never expected. Think about all the people in the Bible who had to trust that God was still writing their stories even when it looked like they were finished. Moses, for example, was an orphaned baby raised in Pharaoh's household and exiled into the wilderness after he fled for his life. But God wasn't done with Moses. In fact, the story of Moses' life didn't really begin until he was an older man, wandering in the desert. It was there that God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, a mission he never would have expected. What seemed like a closed chapter turned out to be the start of something extraordinary. Then there's David, who was overlooked by his own father when the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel. David was just a shepherd boy, forgotten and underestimated, yet God wasn't done with him. He would go on to defeat Goliath, lead a nation, and write some of the most powerful psalms we still read today. His story wasn't over when others wrote him off. And what about the Apostle Paul? He was once Saul, a man who persecuted Christians and tried to destroy the very faith he would one day devote his life to spreading. His life was a mess, and it seemed like the story had already been written. A life defined by hatred and violence. But then God intervened. Paul's transformation was radical, and his new story, his real story, was just beginning. He went on to spread the gospel, planting churches and writing letters that continue to shape the Christian faith to this day. These examples show us that no matter how our current circumstances look, God is still in control. He is still at work, even in the seasons that seem the hardest, when we feel lost or abandoned. He is still writing our story, and it's never too late for him to turn things around. You may be in a place where you feel like your story has stalled. You might feel stuck in a job you don't love, in a relationship that's falling apart, or in a personal struggle that seems unending. But let me tell you this, God is still writing. He's not done with you yet. He's still working, still shaping, still preparing you for something incredible. What you see as the end could very well be the beginning of something new. Trust in his timing, even when it doesn't make sense. Trust that he's writing a story that is far greater than your own plans. There is no moment too dark, no failure too great, and no setback too significant that God can't use it for his glory and your good. You might be facing a chapter right now that feels confusing, painful, or even hopeless. But remember, he is the author, and he knows how the story ends. So hold on, don't give up. Even when you can't see the next chapter, even when it feels like the pages are blank, know that God is still writing your story. He's still working out his purpose in you. And just like with Moses, David, Paul, and countless others, your best chapters might be just around the corner. Your story is not over. God is still writing it, and the ending, it's going to be something more beautiful than you could have ever imagined. It's easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of life's challenges. When we're in the middle of a tough season, whether it's a personal struggle, a difficult relationship, or an overwhelming set of circumstances, it can feel like that's all we are. We start to believe that the situation we're facing right now is who we are, and it can begin to shape the way we see our future. We think that this struggle will define the rest of our lives. But I want to remind you that the present moment, no matter how hard it seems, is not the final chapter of your story. It's only a part of it. When we face hardships, it can sometimes feel like we're stuck in an unending loop. The stress, frustration, or pain becomes the lens through which we view everything. It's easy to feel like we're trapped, unable to move forward. But we need to take a step back and remind ourselves that the current chapter of our lives doesn't have the power to define who we are or dictate the entire story that God is writing for us. God is still working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. His plans are greater than what we can comprehend in any given moment. The difficulties we face may feel overwhelming, but we must understand that God sees the bigger picture. While we might focus on the obstacles in front of us, He is working out a greater purpose. We often don't see how He's using every experience, good or bad, to shape us and guide us towards something more meaningful. Think about the times in your life when you've looked back and seen how far you've come. There are probably moments where, in the midst of your pain or uncertainty, you thought you wouldn't make it through. Yet, somehow, you did. And not only did you survive, but you grew. You gained wisdom, strength, and resilience. In hindsight, you can see how God used even the hardest parts of your journey to prepare you for what was ahead. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. God has a way of taking our brokenness and turning it into something beautiful. The struggles we endure don't define our future, they refine us. Just because things are hard right now doesn't mean they always will be. Just because you're facing setbacks doesn't mean you're stuck forever. The chapter you're in may feel like a dead end, but God is the author, and He can take any story and turn it around. The story isn't finished just because things feel bleak in the moment. When you're struggling, it's important to remind yourself that your story isn't just a series of isolated events. It's a narrative that is still unfolding. Sometimes it's easy to focus solely on the challenges we're facing, but that's not the whole story. Just as a novel can have a series of dark chapters that lead to a resolution, your life is no different. What might seem like a setback could very well be a setup for something greater. Imagine a writer crafting a novel filled with twists and turns. There are always moments of tension, conflict, and obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. But a great story doesn't leave the characters in the midst of their struggles. It moves them forward. And so it is with God's story for you. Even in the darkest times, He is working to bring you into something new, something better. What we may see as a hopeless situation may, in reality, be the beginning of a new chapter filled with growth, restoration, and purpose. One of the hardest things to remember in times of trouble is that God's plans are not limited by our circumstances. We tend to think that if things aren't going well right now, they never will. But that's not the truth. God is not bound by the same limitations we are. He is not restricted by our failures, our doubts, or our mistakes. In fact, those very things might be the tools He uses to shape us into the person we're meant to become. The key to surviving difficult times is to keep moving forward, even when the path isn't clear. Trust that God is working behind the scenes, even when you can't see. Just because you're struggling now doesn't mean you'll always be. This moment doesn't define you. It's just a small part of a much bigger story that God is writing. You may not see the end of the story right now, but you don't need to. God's perspective is far greater than ours, and He's already got the plan in motion. He knows the outcome, and it's going to be better than anything you could imagine. Your current circumstances might be difficult, but they don't have the power to limit your future. God's story for you is one of hope, redemption, and transformation. So even when it feels like the story is stuck in a sad chapter, trust that God is still turning the pages. He's not finished with you yet. Life is full of unpredictability. Every day we face new challenges, new people, and new circumstances that seem to be out of our control. We navigate through seasons of uncertainty, struggle, and confusion, often questioning where everything is headed. During these times, it's easy to feel lost or as though things are spiraling out of control. But here's the truth. In the midst of it all, God is the ultimate author of your story. Just as a skilled writer holds complete control over the plot, the characters, and the outcome of a novel, God holds the pen when it comes to the narrative of your life. When we think of a story, whether in a book, a film, or any form of art, we recognize that it doesn't just happen by accident. It takes time, intention, and careful planning. The author weaves together a series of events, building tension, creating depth in the characters, and guiding the story toward a resolution. It's never chaotic. There's always a purpose behind each chapter, each plot twist, and each detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. In the same way, God is at work in every aspect of your life, even when it doesn't seem like it. The difficulties you face, the challenges you encounter, and even the moments of joy and peace are all part of His grand design. Nothing in your life is random. There is no coincidence in what you experience. God has intentionally placed every piece of the puzzle in its rightful place. We often get frustrated when things don't go the way we expect or hope. Plans fall apart, relationships falter, and dreams seem to fade away. In those moments, we might be tempted to think that we're lost in an unwritten chapter, or that we've somehow fallen off track. But God doesn't work the way we do. His plan for you is not subject to the limitations of time or circumstances. He sees the beginning, the middle, and the end all at once. What seems like chaos to us is often part of a larger narrative that God is crafting with a purpose. Think about the characters in some of the most well-known stories. In many of them, the protagonist faces moments of uncertainty, confusion, and despair. From the outside looking in, it can seem like there's no clear direction. But as the story unfolds, we begin to see how all the pieces fit together. The challenges and obstacles the character faces are not meaningless. They're stepping stones that lead to growth, transformation, and ultimately, victory. God works the same way in your life. Every moment, every decision, every setback is part of a greater narrative that He is carefully orchestrating. He doesn't waste anything. Even in moments of pain or hardship, He is working to bring about good in ways we may not fully understand. We often try to write our own stories. We make plans, set goals, and try to control our future. There's nothing wrong with ambition, but when we try to write the narrative ourselves, we sometimes get overwhelmed by the pressure of making everything turn out perfectly. We put all our hope in our ability to control the outcome, only to find that life doesn't always cooperate with our plans. But God, as the ultimate author, has the perfect script for our lives. His plot is far greater than anything we could dream up for ourselves. When we trust God as the author, we let go of our need to control every aspect of the story. Instead, we lean into the trust that He knows what's best for us. Just like a reader might trust an author to deliver an engaging story with a satisfying ending, we can trust that God will guide us through the twists and turns, knowing that the outcome will be one that brings Him glory and works for our good. This doesn't mean there won't be hard moments or detours, but it does mean that God is actively working through those moments to shape us into the person He created us to be. There will be chapters in our lives that are difficult to understand, times when we can't see the purpose behind the pain or confusion. Yet, just as in a novel, those chapters serve a purpose. They create tension, build character, and move the story forward. Without those challenging moments, the resolution wouldn't have the same power. Without the valleys, we wouldn't appreciate the mountaintops. Every chapter, every moment, no matter how difficult, is part of the greater narrative that God is writing. The beauty of knowing that God is the ultimate author of your life is that He's not just a distant, uninvolved writer. He's deeply invested in the story He's creating. He knows the intricacies of your heart, the dreams that are tucked away in your soul, and the challenges that threaten to overwhelm you. He's not just watching from a distance. He's involved every step of the way, guiding, loving, and leading you toward the life he has planned for you. When things seem out of control, remind yourself that God is in the driver's seat. Even in the moments of uncertainty, trust that he's still writing. He's using every detail, every plot twist, every moment of joy and pain to create a story that reflects his glory and brings you closer to the person he has called you to be. You simply need to trust the author who knows exactly what he's doing. His story for you is unfolding, and it's going to be more beautiful than you could ever imagine. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when we least expect it. It's easy to feel like we're on solid ground one moment, and then, in a heartbeat, everything seems to fall apart. We've all experienced those moments where plans go awry, dreams are dashed, or we face unexpected setbacks that shake our sense of stability. During these times, it's natural to wonder if everything is lost, or if our future will ever look the way we imagined. But what if those setbacks are not the end of the story, but rather a preparation for something greater? Sometimes it takes a step back to see that what we initially view as failure or frustration is actually part of a much larger plan. When everything seems to fall apart, it could very well be God's way of setting the stage for something even more incredible than we had ever hoped for. In the moment, it's hard to understand why we go through certain challenges, but in hindsight, we can often see that these setbacks were necessary to get us where we needed to be. Just as a writer uses tension and conflict to create a compelling narrative, God allows struggles in our lives to prepare us for greater things ahead. If we look back at the stories of Moses, David, and Paul, we can see how setbacks were the stepping stones to their greatest achievements. Each of these men faced moments where it appeared their story had come to a standstill, but in reality, those so-called dead ends were the very beginnings of something extraordinary. Moses' journey is a powerful example of how a setback can be a setup for greater things. At first, Moses seemed to have it all, a position of privilege as an adopted member of Pharaoh's household, yet he was forced to flee Egypt after killing an Egyptian man who was mistreating a Hebrew slave. For years, Moses lived in exile, tending sheep in the wilderness. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like Moses' life was a failure. His dreams of leading the Israelites out of slavery seemed impossible. But in the desert, where he thought his purpose had been lost, God was preparing him for a greater mission. The years of isolation were not wasted. They were a time of preparation. When God called Moses to return to Egypt and lead his people out of bondage, Moses was equipped with the humility, wisdom, and strength needed for the task. The setback wasn't the end, it was the foundation for something monumental. David's story offers another example. As a young shepherd, he was overlooked by his own family and left out of important events. But God had chosen him to be the future king of Israel. David's journey to the throne wasn't easy, though. He faced rejection, betrayal, and years of running from King Saul, who saw him as a threat. In the midst of this turmoil, David could have easily given up. He could have let the constant setbacks define him and quit pursuing the future God had promised him. But instead, these difficult experiences refined him. They taught him how to rely on God's strength, to trust his timing, and to develop the heart of a true leader. When the time came for David to step into his role as king, he was not only ready, but equipped to lead Israel in ways he never could have if he hadn't faced those setbacks along the way. And then there's the story of Paul, who started his journey as Saul, a fierce persecutor of Christians. Saul was known for hunting down and arresting believers, believing he was serving God in doing so. But God had other plans. On the road to Damascus, Saul encountered Jesus in a powerful way, and his life was forever changed. However, his transformation wasn't instant. He was blinded for several days and spent years in isolation, unsure of how he would fit into God's plan. He could have viewed this time of uncertainty and struggle as a complete derailment of his life, but instead, it became the place where his calling was refined. Once Paul emerged from this period of testing, He became one of the greatest missionaries and church planters the world has ever known. His letters are now foundational texts in Christianity. What looked like a setback, a man who was once an enemy of the faith, was actually the perfect setup for God to use Paul in mighty ways. These stories show us that setbacks, though painful, often serve as the preparation ground for God's bigger plans. When we face challenges, we might feel like we're being held back or that we're stuck in a place of frustration, confusion, or failure. But what if, instead of seeing them as obstacles, we viewed them as opportunities for God to refine us, to shape us into the person He needs us to be for what's ahead? Just as a sculptor chisels away at the stone to reveal a masterpiece, God uses our struggles to mold us into something greater. The reality is that God's plans for us are often bigger than what we can see in the moment. We might not understand why things aren't working out the way we thought, but we can trust that God is at work in every setback, even when we can't see the full picture. He is using those difficult times to prepare us for something far more significant than we could ever imagine. So, if you're in the middle of a setback right now, don't give up. Trust that God is setting you up for something bigger, something better, something that will bring Him glory and fulfill the purpose He has for your life. What seems like a closed chapter might actually be the opening of a new, incredible part of your story. Just as in the lives of Moses, David, and Paul, your setbacks may very well be God's way of preparing you for the greatest things He has planned for you. The struggle is not the end, it's the setup for something extraordinary. Keep trusting Him and know that He's working behind the scenes to bring about something far greater than you could ever ask or imagine. There are moments in life when we find ourselves waiting. We wait for the right job opportunity, for the perfect relationship, for healing, or for things to finally fall into place. During these seasons of waiting, it's easy to become impatient, frustrated, or even disheartened. We often wonder, why is this taking so long? Why hasn't things turned out the way I hoped by now? In those moments, it's important to remember that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. It's natural to want things to happen on our timeline. We set goals, create plans, and work hard to make things happen as quickly as possible. We see others around us moving forward, and it can sometimes feel like we're being left behind. We look at our lives and wonder why things aren't happening the way we envisioned, or why the answers to our prayers are delayed. He sees the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. He knows the perfect moment for everything to unfold. Timing isn't just a passive thing, it's an active, intentional part of His plan for our lives. The delay we experience may feel like a setback, but in reality it could be God preparing us for something greater, something beyond our understanding. Think about the story of Abraham. When God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, Abraham didn't immediately see the fulfillment of that promise. He and his wife Sarah waited for years, decades in fact. They were well into their old age before they saw the birth of Isaac, the child through whom God's promise would be fulfilled. During that waiting period, Abraham had moments of doubt, fear, and frustration, but ultimately God's timing was perfect. If Abraham had rushed ahead and tried to make God's promise happen in his own way, he would have missed the blessing that came from trusting God's timing. God was working not just in the circumstances, but in Abraham's heart, preparing him to receive the promise when the time was right. Another example comes from the life of Joseph. As a young man, Joseph was given a dream that he would one day rule over his family. But instead of stepping directly into that leadership role, Joseph's life took a drastic turn. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime, and thrown into prison. For years, he faced hardship, uncertainty, and injustice. To anyone looking at Joseph's life, it would have appeared as though his dreams were impossible, even laughable. But in the silence of those years, God was at work. He was preparing Joseph for the moment when he would rise to power in Egypt and save his family and an entire nation from famine. The delay was not a sign of God's failure, it was part of the process. Joseph's character was being molded, and his trust in God was deepening. He could not have stepped into the fullness of God's plan for his life without going through the waiting, the testing, and the refining process. God's timing was at work all along, even when Joseph couldn't see it. But trusting God's timing allows us to step into His plan at the exact right moment, with the right heart and the right preparation. Think about the process of planting a seed. A seed doesn't sprout overnight. It goes through a period of growth underground, unseen by the human eye. But without that time of growth and development, the seed could never become the plant it was meant to be. The same is true for us. Sometimes we need to grow in ways that aren't immediately visible, and God's timing allows for that growth. We may feel like we're stuck or that nothing is happening, but God is working in us, preparing us for what's ahead. If we try to rush the process or force things to happen before we're ready, we might miss out on the fullness of what God has planned. There are also moments when we want God to answer our prayers immediately, and when He doesn't, we begin to doubt His goodness or His love for us. Yet, in those times of waiting, we can rest in the knowledge that God is working all things together for our good. He knows exactly what we need, and He knows the perfect time to give it to us. Delays aren't denials. Just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't. God is simply preparing us, building our faith and making sure we're ready for the blessings He has in store. In times of waiting, it's easy to focus on the lack, to feel like we're missing out, or to compare ourselves to others who seem to be further along. But God calls us to trust Him. He calls us to be patient, knowing that His timing is far better than our own. Instead of rushing to make things happen, we are invited to rest in His sovereignty, to trust that He knows what's best for us, and to wait expectantly for the right moment. So when you find yourself in a season of waiting, don't be discouraged. Trust that God is working behind the scenes, even when you can't see it. Don't rush the process. Trust that He is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine, and that when the time is right, He will make all things beautiful in His perfect timing. The best is yet to come. Life can sometimes feel like a series of mistakes, missteps, and brokenness. We all have those moments where we look at our past and wonder if we've gone too far, if we've messed up too much for things to ever be made right again. The weight of our failures, regrets, and mistakes can feel overwhelming, and it's easy to believe that our story has been irreparably tainted. But the truth is, no matter how lost or broken you feel, it is never too late for God to redeem your story. In fact, it's in those very places of pain, failure, and brokenness that God's redemption shines the brightest. When we look at the idea of redemption, we have to remember that it doesn't mean simply erasing the past or pretending it never happened. Redemption is about transformation. It's about God taking what was broken, lost, or damaged and bringing healing, restoration, and new purpose out of it. The mistakes and regrets that we carry don't have to define us. They are not the end of the story. In fact, they can be part of the beautiful tapestry that God is weaving in our lives. Think about the story of Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. Peter was a man who had followed Jesus, witnessed incredible miracles, and even boldly declared that he would never deny Jesus. Yet, in the most critical moment, Peter did exactly what he swore he would never do. He denied Jesus 3 times. He was devastated by his failure, feeling the weight of his betrayal, and in that moment it must have seemed like his relationship with Jesus was forever broken. But that wasn't the end for Peter. After Jesus' resurrection, he sought Peter out, not to condemn him, but to restore him. He asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And with each affirmation, Jesus restored Peter, giving him a new purpose, to feed his sheep and lead his church. Peter's failure wasn't the end of his story. It was part of his redemption. Jesus took what was broken and used it to build something greater. Peter's story reminds us that even our greatest failures do not define our future. God has the power to rewrite the parts of our lives that we thought were beyond hope. He doesn't erase our past, but He transforms it. He takes our brokenness and gives us a new direction, a new purpose. The shame we feel about our mistakes can hold us captive, but redemption is about freedom. God's redemption allows us to move forward, no longer defined by our failures, but by His grace and His call. This principle is woven throughout Scripture, from the stories of great men and women of faith to the lives of ordinary people who have experienced God's redemptive power. take, for example, the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John. The religious leaders brought her before Jesus, ready to stone her according to the law. She was caught in the act, and in their eyes, she deserved judgment. But Jesus, full of compassion, responded by saying, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the accusers walked away, leaving the woman standing alone before Jesus. Jesus didn't condemn her, but instead, he extended grace, telling her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." In that moment, Jesus didn't just forgive her, he gave her the chance for a new life, a life free from the shame of her past. Her story was not over, it was redeemed. Redemption is not just about forgiving the past. It's about God's power to transform our future. No matter how far we've fallen, no matter how deeply we've failed, God's redemptive work has the ability to bring healing and restoration. It's in those moments of brokenness that God's grace is most evident. He doesn't wait for us to be perfect or to have everything figured out before he begins his work of restoration. He meets us in our mess, in our failures, and in our brokenness, and he begins the process of making us whole again. Think about the story of the Apostle Paul, who was once known as Saul, a man who was notorious for persecuting Christians. He actively sought to destroy the early church, and by all accounts, his past was filled with violence and hatred. Yet God saw something in Saul that no one else could see. On the road to Damascus, Saul encountered Jesus, and in that moment, his life was forever changed. His name was changed from Saul to Paul, and he became one of the greatest proponents of the Christian faith. His letters are now some of the most foundational texts in the New Testament. Paul's story is a powerful reminder that no one is beyond redemption. Even the deepest of wounds, the darkest of pasts, can be transformed by God's love and grace. The process of redemption doesn't always happen instantly. Sometimes it's a slow journey, a step-by-step restoration where we begin to see the healing of old wounds and the transformation of old habits. But God is patient, and his redemptive work in us is ongoing. No matter how deep our regrets run or how long we've carried the weight of our failures, God's grace is, he is a God who specializes in making all things new, who takes the broken pieces of our lives and makes something beautiful out of them. Perhaps you're carrying a burden from your past that feels too heavy to bear. Maybe you're looking at a mistake you made or a decision you regret, and it feels like that's all you are now. But I want to remind you that it's never too late for God to redeem your story. His grace is sufficient, his love is unending, and his power to restore is limitless. Your past does not have to define you. God has the ability to rewrite the narrative and bring you into a future filled with healing, restoration, and purpose. There's always room for redemption, and with God, it's never too late. Life has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. We go through seasons where everything seems to be at its peak. The relationships are flourishing, our career is progressing, or we feel a sense of purpose and fulfillment. In those moments, it's easy to think that we've already reached the best part of our story, that the greatest chapters have been written, and everything that follows will just be a continuation of what we've already experienced. But the truth is, the best chapters of our lives are often yet to come. Even when we're in the middle of hardship, pain, or waiting, God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for breakthroughs and blessings that we cannot yet see. Sometimes we get stuck in the narrative of what we think should be the climax of our story. We imagine that the happiest moments, the most successful years, or the highest achievements are meant to happen in a particular season of our lives. But God doesn't always work according to our timeline or our expectations. He often reserves the best chapters for the future. And it's in those waiting periods, those seasons of struggle and uncertainty, that he is preparing us for what's to come. The pain, the waiting, the unanswered prayers, and even the setbacks are all part of the process of shaping us for the breakthrough moments that will define the next chapter of our lives. Think about the story of Joseph, one of the most powerful examples of this truth. Joseph was a young man who had big dreams, dreams that he believed would bring him honor and success. But his life took a very different path than what he imagined. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit, and spent years in obscurity and suffering. If you had asked Joseph in those years if he was living his best chapter, he might have told you that his story was over. Yet, it wasn't the end. In those years of waiting, God was working behind the scenes, preparing Joseph for a future that was far greater than he could have imagined. When the time was right, Joseph was elevated to a position of power in Egypt, where he not only saved the nation from famine, but also reconciled with his family and fulfilled the dreams God had given him. The best chapters of Joseph's life were not the ones he had initially envisioned. They were the ones that came after the pain, after the struggle, after the waiting. Our stories are often the same way. We go through seasons where we feel like we've reached the peak or the best chapter, only to be met with unforeseen challenges or delays. We might feel frustrated or even defeated by the twists and turns in our narrative, but those moments are often preparing us for something greater. God knows the timing, and he understands the depth of the preparation we need before stepping into the next part of our journey. It's like an author who doesn't rush the development of the plot. They know that the tension, the conflict, and the struggles the characters face are necessary for the climax of the story. Without the build-up, the resolution would lack the impact it's meant to have. In the same way, the challenges we face are preparing us for a greater purpose, and the best chapters are often the ones that come after the struggle. When we experience pain or hardship, it's easy to think that we've been abandoned or that we'll never experience joy again. But the Bible reassures us that God is working all things together for good. Even in the toughest seasons, he is preparing us for a future that is beyond what we can imagine. It's during these difficult times that our character is refined, our faith is strengthened, and our capacity to appreciate the beauty of the breakthroughs ahead is developed. The struggle isn't in vain. It's part of the greatest story God is writing. Consider the story of Ruth, a woman who experienced deep loss, only to have her story transformed into one of redemption and restoration. Ruth lost her husband, and with that her sense of security and hope for the future. But God had a plan for her that was far greater than she could have ever imagined. Through her loyalty and faith, Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David, and in her lineage, Jesus himself would be born. Ruth's story didn't end in despair. It ended with a legacy of greatness. In her darkest moments, when it seemed like everything was falling apart, God was writing the next chapter of her life that would lead to a breakthrough beyond her understanding. The key to embracing this truth is trust. It's trusting that our story is far from over, no matter what it may look like right now. It's trusting that even when we face pain, delay, or confusion, God is still writing the chapters of our lives. The struggles we face today are not the end of the story. They are part of the journey towards something greater. It's like a long and complex novel where each chapter builds on the previous one, leading toward a conclusion that is more beautiful than we could have imagined. We need to remind ourselves that our lives are not a series of isolated moments or random events. They are part of a larger narrative that God is unfolding. When we feel stuck or discouraged, we must remember that the best chapters are often ahead of us. The pain we experience today can be the very thing that prepares us for the blessings of tomorrow. Our dreams, our hopes, and our prayers are not in vain, and the delays or detours along the way are not signs of failure. They are part of the process of God preparing us for what is to come. So when you feel like you've reached the peak, or when you're in the middle of a difficult season, don't lose heart. Trust that God is writing a story that is bigger and better than you can see right now. Your best chapters are still to come, and the journey you're on is leading you to a future that is filled with hope, restoration, and fulfillment. The greatest parts of your story are still being written, and they will be worth the wait.